Thank you. Okay, so welcome. My name is Patricia Rosenmeyer, and I am the faculty director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Sylvia and Irving Margolis Lecture on the Jewish Experience in the American South. This lectureship was made possible by generous gifts from Alan and Gail Fields and Gary and Sandra Smiley, in honor of Gail and Sandra's parents, who were longtime residents of Williamston, North Carolina. Their father, Irving Margolis, co-owned and ran a clothing business for 52 years. Their mother, Sylvia Levy Margolis, was a woman of valor in her small town. She was the driving force behind integrating the Williamston Library in the 1960s so that Black children could check out books alongside their white peers. She was president of the North Carolina Association of Jewish Women and one of the founders of the North Carolina Jewish Home for the Aged. Our lecture tonight honors both Sylvia and Irving and their identity as Southern Jews. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to make sure you all know about next week's events. On Monday, November 14th, our grad student, Emily Branton, will give an Emerging Scholars Talk online, so on Zoom. She'll share her dissertation research in a talk titled Breathing Out Violence, Fake News and Other Dangerous Speech in Ancient Israel. So you can visit our website to register. In spring semester, we'll have several more events, and we have lots of details on our website and also in our newsletter. And I'll just highlight that we have our 20th anniversary, it's the 21st century, anniversary event, which is a jazz performance with Israeli musician Daniel Zamir, and that's going to be on the evening of March 2nd. So all these events are made possible through generous gifts to the center. And in fact, everything we do at the center is made possible because of the support of alumni and friends. If you'd like more information on how you can contribute to the center and help us meet our mission, you can visit us at jewishstudies.unc.edu. We also have some printed material in the lobby, and I think I saw some of you that picked that up. So we're delighted to have David Weinfeld with us tonight. Dr. Weinfeld is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and World Religions at Rowan University in New Jersey. He earned his PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and History at New York University. His first book, titled An American Friendship, Horace Callan, Alan Locke, and the Development of Cultural Pluralism, was published this year by Cornell University Press. Congratulations on that. He also has published articles in the Journal of American History, the American Jewish Archives Journal, and the journal Southern Jewish History. His current book project is on American Jews and the Lost Cause, and that is the topic of tonight's lecture. So please join me in welcoming David Weinfeld.
Thank you, Patricia, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. I know that I have to say I'm really happy that the talk doesn't conflict with the basketball game later on tonight, because I would hate for you to have to miss the basketball game, which of course you would choose to come to the talk. So I'm glad that the scheduling worked out that way. I also want to thank Gail and Alan Fields and Sandra Smiley, who endowed this lecture in honor of their parents, Sylvia and Irving Margolis. I want to thank Professor Ruth von Bernuth, who invited me to speak here, and Karen Gajewski, who is the executive director of the Carolina Center for Judaic Studies, and administrator there, Andrea Cummings, who've made my stay here really, really wonderful. Thanks to Professor Emeritus Marcy Cohen-Ferris for helping introduce me to the field of Southern Jewish history. Huge thanks to my friend Andrea Cooper, my classmate at NYU, and a wonderful professor of Jewish thought here at UNC, for being the driving force behind bringing me here. You are all really lucky to have her at UNC. And since I'm doing all these thank yous, I might as well make it a little like a bar mitzvah and thank my out-of-town guests Carl and Marilyn, who came all the way from Virginia to hear me speak. So thanks to you as well. So I want to make a confession. I'm not a Southerner. I'm such a Northerner, in fact, that I'm Canadian. I didn't even know what pimento cheese was before I moved to Richmond, Virginia, 6.5 years ago. But I moved to Richmond at a pivotal time in the city's history, in all of Southern history, as activists persuaded the American public to take down the symbols honoring the Southern cause in the Civil War, or in some cases, took down those symbols themselves. We are living through Southern history right now. And though I have since moved to Philadelphia, I am so excited to be part of a growing cadre of scholars interested in the burgeoning subfield of Southern Jewish history, because so much of the complicated Jewish role in this story has yet to be told, and because the unique history of Jews in the South can speak to our present moment. Now, as you may have heard, there is an election going on in this country tomorrow. The rhetoric around politics here really does feel like a culture war, so polarized, so black and white. And yet my role as a historian is to provide nuance, which can be hard to do because anti-Semitism in America has flared up again over the past couple of weeks, and I'm deeply troubled by this. Along with increased anti-Semitism, the United States has been going through a racial reckoning these past couple of years, trying to undo the legacy of slavery and of Jim Crow. The lost cause, the ongoing commemoration of the Confederacy and Confederate war effort, has played a major role in that legacy. In trying to understand how and why some Jews commemorated the lost cause, I'm hoping that we can all learn from the past to build bridges between our divided communities today and tomorrow. So now, let us go back in time. Perhaps the clearest expression of the lost cause by a Southern Jew did not occur in the American South, or even in the American North, but in Rome, Italy. Moses Ezekiel, a proud Sephardic Jew, native of Richmond, Virginia, and veteran of the Confederate Army, had moved to Europe after the Civil War and become a celebrated sculptor. In 1876, in honor of the centennial anniversary of America's founding and commissioned by the United Order of B'nai B'rith, Ezekiel had completed his sculpture, Religious Liberty. Today it stands on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, in front of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. It was this work that made Ezekiel perhaps the most celebrated Jewish artist of his day and solidified his legacy as a Jewish artist. But 15 years later, Ezekiel expressed disappointment at having his bid to craft a sculpture of his hero and friend, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, that was ultimately rejected. In a letter to the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument Association of Richmond, Ezekiel opined, "To honor the dead soldiers, the true heroes of a lost but just and sacred cause, must be to call forth the applause and sympathy of all men who may feel a brotherhood in the South." Ezekiel had wanted to honor the man, wanted the honor of being the man to celebrate General Lee, who he called the leader of the army of the South, who, fearless of danger, defying death and misrepresentation, has the brightest star in our glorious constellation. Not much clearer an expression of the lost cause than that. It is well known that prior to the Civil War, some Jews in the United States owned enslaved people, and that many Southern Jewish men fought for the Confederacy. Less well known is the story of Jewish commemoration of the lost cause. What is the lost cause? The lost cause was the notion that the Confederacy was a just and honorable experiment, that slavery was benign and even beneficial to the enslaved African Americans, and at the same time, not the real cause of the Civil War, which of course was states' rights to the lost causers. According to lost cause adherents, the noble Southern slavocracy had been defended by a valiant Confederate military with saintly and heroic generals, Robert E. Lee, the saintliest of them all. The lost cause was propagated in different ways through textbooks in schools, through memorial ceremonies, and by building massive monuments to Confederate so-called heroes. Though Moses Ezekiel never made the majestic Lee statue of his dreams, he created monuments to the Confederacy across the country. From Virginia mourning her dead at his alma mater, the Virginia Military Institute, to a statue called Southern at Johnston's Island, Ohio, in the middle of Lake Erie, the site of a Union prisoner of war camp. He made a statue of Thomas Stonewall Jackson that stands in Charleston, West Virginia. And his most famous Confederate monument sits in Arlington National Cemetery in Northern Virginia. This Confederate memorial, unveiled on June 4th, 1914, just before the First World War, was called by Ezekiel New South and depicted not just heroic Confederate soldiers, but also, if you look carefully on the right, enslaved African Americans, whom the United Daughters of the Confederacy, key sponsors of the monument, labeled faithful black servants. This made Ezekiel the foremost sculptor of the lost cause. Ezekiel's legacy has grown controversial of late. This past December, an exhibit at Princeton University on 19th century Jewish artists was canceled, and I mean literally canceled, not metaphorically, because it included a sculpture by Ezekiel. Struggles over the lost cause remain at the forefront of American culture wars. The removal of Confederate statues across the United States, most famously on Richmond's Monument Avenue, led to a predictable backlash, with many in the South and even the rural North clinging to Confederate symbols and lost cause imagery as forms of resistance to a liberal elite. So the question remains, given the continuing significance of the lost cause in America's culture wars, where do American Jews, and in particular Southern Jews, fit into this conversation about Confederate memory and the lost cause? In my talk today, I argue that since the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War, all the way through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and beyond, some Jews in the American South participated in lost cause commemoration in order to better fully integrate into the white Christian majority. At the same time, they commemorated the lost cause in such a way that preserved and even celebrated their particularly Jewish religious identity. Furthermore, I argue that through lost cause commemoration, Southern Jews solidified a specifically Southern Jewish identity, an identity tied to an entire region rather than a specific city or state. The story of Jewish lost cause commemoration is also a story about whiteness in America. Despite significant anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States, Jews were defined as white and defined themselves as white all across the country, especially in the Jim Crow South, where the racial divide loomed largest. Jewish whiteness enabled Jewish participation in lost cause commemoration, augmenting their sense of belonging in the South in a way that was, of course, denied to African Americans. At the same time, we should not neglect the significance of the aforementioned anti-Semitism. Though anti-Semitism in America was without question less prevalent than in Europe, it was still ever present and shaped the lives, experiences, and decisions of the American Jewish population. After the Civil War, anti-Semitism grew with the massive influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though this immigration came mostly to large northern cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, it affected the South as well. The infamous Leo Frank case of 1915, where a Jewish man in Atlanta was wrongly convicted of murder and then lynched by an angry mob, was the most prominent example of this resurgent anti-Semitism. In the 1920s, Henry Ford published anti-Semitic tracts in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which had a national audience. Ivy League schools instituted Jewish quotas. A resurgent Ku Klux Klan targeted not only African Americans, but Catholics and Jews as well. By 1924, nativists and the government restricted immigration from Eastern Europe dramatically, effectively barring most Jews from coming to the United States. In the 1930s, Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic radio broadcast reached millions of Americans, and the German-American Bund openly embraced Nazism. I mention all this anti-Semitism not to justify Jewish participation in Lost Cause commemoration. In my opinion, it is not the historian's task to justify or even to judge. The historian must explain. This was the context in which Southern Jews lived. Anti-Semitism, or perhaps more importantly, the fear of anti-Semitism, even when it seemed largely absent, was an enormous factor in the lives of Southern Jewry. Any opportunity to blend in, to be part of the mainstream, was an opportunity to avoid anti-Semitism. In the South, Lost Cause commemoration represented one such opportunity, including for Jews whose families immigrated to the South long after the Civil War, and even Jews who migrated from the North. For some Southern Jews, I suspect it was easier and came more naturally to ultimately support racial integration than it would have to oppose commemoration of the Lost Cause. And yet, there is a contradiction at the heart of Jewish commemoration of the Lost Cause. While Jews did want to fit in, to be accepted as equals and truly belong in the South, they rarely converted to Christianity. This is important because the Lost Cause was at once secular and religious. In his book, Baptized in Blood, The Religion of the Lost Cause, historian Charles Reagan Wilson understands the Lost Cause as the civil religion of the South, arguing the Lost Cause was a mythic construct that helped white Southerners define a cultural identity in the aftermath of Confederate defeat. Yet, despite calling it a civil religion, Wilson insists that evangelical Protestantism lay at the heart of Southern identity and was central to Southern efforts to wage a cultural war against Northern influences. In essence, Christianity was crucial to the Lost Cause. How then did Southern Jews thread the needle? How did they walk this tightrope, having to deflect anti-Semitism, assert their belonging among the dominant white Christian population of the South through its supposedly civil religion of the Lost Cause, while at the same time avoiding the overwhelming Protestant overtones of this religion? After all, the resurrectionist rhetoric, the South shall rise again, was nothing if not Christian in derivation. The recently departed Eli Evans, native of Durham and proud alumnus of this university, pointed me to an answer in his magnificent work of Southern Jewish history, The Provincials, written in the early 1970s. Evans recalled a conversation with an elderly Jewish woman in rural Virginia who proclaimed that Robert E. Lee ranked with Moses. Many, perhaps most Southern Jews were proud of Jewish participation in the Confederate war effort. Nonetheless, they still performed a balancing act, walking a tightrope between acceptance and anti-Semitism, between a sense of justice for African Americans and the racist attitudes that dominated the United States, between civil religion and overbearing Christianity. Their balance beam to walk this tightrope was a uniquely Jewish commemoration of the lost cause. So my focus today will not be on Jews like Moses Ezekiel, who celebrated the lost cause as any white Christian Southerner would. Instead, I'm going to focus on the specifically Jewish commemoration of the lost cause, which is to say the celebration of Jewish Confederate leaders and soldiers, and especially that celebration in Jewish terms and Jewish contexts. Since I spent the last 6 years living in Richmond, Virginia, many of my examples will be from there, though Jewish lost cause commemoration was very much a pan-Southern phenomenon. My talk is divided into 3 sections. First, I'm going to provide a range of examples of Jewish commemoration of the lost cause in the South from the end of the Civil War through to the present day. Then briefly, I'm going to focus specifically on commemoration of Judah P. Benjamin, the Sephardic Jew who was Attorney General, Secretary of State, and Secretary of War for the Confederate States of America, which helped to consolidate a uniquely Southern Jewish identity. In the final section, I'm going to look at more localized examples of Jewish lost cause commemoration, especially in post-World War II Richmond. To conclude, I'll offer some analysis as to why Jews participated in lost cause commemoration and how that participation forged their identities as specifically Southern Jews, but how that identity is now diminishing as both the South and the larger Jewish community is transforming. Southern Jews balanced their Jewish and Southern identities by emphasizing Jewish participation in the Confederate Army administration and by using Jewish ceremonies to honor their Confederate heroes. This was the case across the South, but perhaps the best example was the creation of the Soldiers section for Jewish Confederates killed in action in Richmond's Hebrew Cemetery. In May of 1866, in response to the formation of nearby Hollywood Ceremony Memorial Association and the Oakwood Memorial Association, both to honor thousands of Christian Confederate dead, a group of Richmond Jewish women established the Hebrew Ladies Memorial Association to look after some 30 graves of Confederate Jewish soldiers killed in battle near Richmond. The Hebrew Ladies Memorial Association, or HLMA, paid for the Soldiers section upkeep until 1930, when it was transferred to the Hebrew Cemetery itself, and continued holding annual memorial services each year to honor the Jewish Confederate dead there until at least 1939. For the HLMA, maintaining the Soldiers section of Hebrew Cemetery was about more than decorating the graves with flowers every year, though they did that too. It was about desperately wanting to fit in as Jews in a climate where anti-Jewish sentiment still played a prominent role. In her 1866 advertisement to the Israelites of the South, Secretary of the HLMA Rachel Levy made reference to, and I quote, "a brave people's struggle for independence." She was not referring to the formerly enslaved African Americans, but instead to those Confederate soldiers who endured, and I quote, "hardships so nobly for liberty's sake, the myriads of heroes who spilled their blood in defense of that glorious cause." She wanted the Jewish Confederates to be included in that number, implicitly asserting that they shared that noble Southern blood. It's worth noting that she made reference to the South, not to Richmond or even to Virginia. After all, the Jewish soldiers buried at Hebrew Cemetery died in Virginia, but hailed from all over the Confederacy. But then, mentioning the recently formed Oakwood and Hollywood Memorial Associations, Levy noted, and I quote, "the graves of Jewish soldiers, which of course would not be embraced in the work of either of the first named societies, the other memorial associations. Though Southern Jews insisted throughout the antebellum period that they fully belonged to the communities in which they lived, they were not naive about the antipathy they faced from many in the non-Jewish population. They knew that they constantly needed to prove themselves loyal citizens of the South, and thus the HLMA was born to create a lasting place for the slain Jewish Confederates. For Levy, the soldiers' section of Hebrew Cemetery would stand as a symbol of Jewish patriotism and bravery to those who doubted it. Thus, she concluded her call for financial support with another acknowledgement of anti-Jewish sentiment in the South and elsewhere. She wrote, "In time to come, when our grief shall have become in a measure silenced, and when the malicious tongue of slander, ever so ready to assail Israel, shall be raised against us, then, with a feeling of mournful pride, we will point to this monument and say, 'There is our reply.'" This statement impressed the white Christian population of Richmond, and especially women involved in the other memorial associations. These three groups worked in concert, if not together, maintaining friendly relations for decades. They invited each other to the respective Confederate memorial services and sent flowers. Only occasionally did the issue of Jewish religious difference emerge, such as in an undated early 20th century letter from Sarah Strauss Rosenbaum, then secretary of the HLMA, to Lizzie Daniel, secretary of the Hollywood Memorial Association. Rosenbaum thanked her Christian compatriot for a lovely wreath while expressing regret that she could not attend the latter's memorial services because they took place on a Saturday, but promised that a committee would attend the church memorial service, presumably on a Sunday. Keeping the Jewish Sabbath, but attending a church memorial service on Sunday was a way for these women to assert their identity as Jews and as Southerners, and indeed as Southern Jews. As the Reconstruction era moved into the reign of Jim Crow, the notion of a special synergy between Jewish history and the lost cause picked up speed. As the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond is perhaps a special case, and this is reflected in Lost Cause commemoration by Edward Kalish, rabbi of the city's Reform Synagogue Beth Ahava from, if you can believe it, 1891 to 1945. Kalish was a Northerner and a Midwesterner. He was born in Toledo, Ohio in 1865, just after the Civil War. He grew up in Chicago and Cleveland. After being ordained a Reform rabbi in Cincinnati's Hebrew Union College, he held a pulpit in Peoria, Illinois for 4 years before joining congregation Beth Ahava at the tender age of 26. When Kalish came to Virginia, he absorbed Southern culture, including the Lost Cause. Over his long tenure, he presided over numerous Jewish Confederate memorial ceremonies at Hebrew Cemetery, often with non-Jews in attendance. His words were always some variation of these, which he uttered in May of 1900. These soldiers, as Jewish soldiers, did stand for two things: the love of their country and the vindication of their people. Kalish then explained the inaccurate but ever-present stereotype that Jews were loyal to no land and cowards when it came to defending their country. It remained for those fearful yet glorious days of 1861 to 1865, he proclaimed, to tell of the courage and the soldierly qualities which 18 centuries of repression had not eradicated, and of which these men and their brothers in faith gave such sublime evidence. Waxing poetic, Kalish proclaimed that the Maccabean spirit was reborn for those days, before concluding, the cause for which they consciously fought was destined by the God of battles not to be won, but the cause for which they unconsciously struggled has been gloriously helped. The implication of Kalish's words were clear. Jewish Confederates were like the Maccabees. rebelling in a just cause against foreign domination. By celebrating Jewish Confederates, Kalish asserted Jewish belonging in the South in a way utterly denied to African Americans. Of all the Jewish Confederates Kalish celebrated in his long career, one loomed larger than them all. Judah P. Benjamin, Sephardic Jew, and as mentioned earlier, Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State of the Confederate States of America. At a 1902 ceremony at Robert E. Lee Camp for Confederate Veterans in Richmond, Rabbi Kalish presented a portrait of Judah P. Benjamin to the camp. Kalish's remarks praised Benjamin, the so-called brains of the Confederacy. After expounding on Benjamin's career, Kalish remarked, "I stand here in the name of the Jewish community of this city, some of whose members have given the means whereby this presentation has been made possible." It seems then that wealthy members of the Jewish community funded the event and perhaps commissioned the painting itself. Kalish went on, "We do this for the reason that we feel we are honoring ourselves in thus honoring a co-religionist. He was a hero, a statesman, a gentleman, and a patriot. We claim the privilege of sharing in the reflection of his glory." Richmond was Judah P. Benjamin's home for the 4 years of the Civil War, but it was not the only Southern city that celebrated him. The Pan-Southern Jewish commemoration of Benjamin helped establish a regional Southern Jewish identity, distinct from any equivalent in the North. In 1912, local Zionist leader Annie M. Garfinkel penned a lengthy profile of Benjamin for the Nashville paper, the city's mainstream daily, labeling him one of the most wonderful characters in history. 50 years later, in 1962, the Alabama chapter of B'nai B'rith held a themed dinner and dance called Judah P. Benjamin Night. Across the South, through the 1960s and beyond, Judah P. Benjamin served as a Jewish stand-in for Robert E. Lee, a Jewish Confederate hero to commemorate in service of the lost cause. At the same time, many Southern Jewish communities had their local equivalent to Judah P. Benjamin. As Eli Evans notes in The Provincials, the stories of bravery would be passed from generation to generation as Southern Jewish families swelled proudly at the portraits of Confederate infantrymen over their mantels. For Mississippi Jews, it was Max Freudenthal, who had the heart of a lion in battle, quote. While in Arkansas, it was Private Isaac Gleitzman, decorated on the battlefield while managing to keep kosher throughout the entire Civil War. In Mobile, Alabama, it was Major Adolph Proskauer, a proud Confederate veteran who, quote, marched forth from this city with many brave Jewish comrades to join the Southern Army. In Memphis, Tennessee, Jew and non-Jew alike paid homage to Captain Frederick Wolfe, who, quote, belonged to the band of patriotic Jews who entered enthusiastically into the cause of the country of their adoption. But perhaps the best example of localized Southern Jewish lost cause commemoration occurred in Richmond through the figure of Reverend Maximilian Mickelbacher, the religious leader of Beth Ahaba before, during, and after the Civil War. Born in what is now Germany in 1811, Mickelbacher was never officially ordained a rabbi, but had significant Judaic training and served the Richmond Jewish community for many years. Historical records show that Mickelbacher owned at least one enslaved person during his time there. He is best known to American Jewish historians for his so-called Prayer for the Confederacy, which he wrote and delivered early during the Civil War. Mickelbacher had long been a hero to the Richmond Jewish community, and a plaque in his honor still hangs in Beth Ahaba. He was the major figure represented in Richmond's contribution to the 1954 American Jewish tercentenary celebration. The first Jewish community had arrived in New Amsterdam, now New York, in 1654. And 300 years later, 1954, Jews across the United States celebrated this momentous anniversary. This was a moment of pride for American Jewry, including in the South. But it also occurred in a very particular context. In 1954, America was smack in the middle of the Cold War. Stalin was dead, and the very hot Korean War had ended a year prior, but the Soviet Union and Communist China were still considered major threats. Soviet propaganda pointed to the Jim Crow South as evidence of capitalist hypocrisy and immorality. Domestically, the Eisenhower administration downplayed racial strife as best they could. Though Senator Joseph McCarthy's career was on the way down, the memory of the Rosenberg trial that saw Jewish Americans Julius and Ethel Rosenberg executed in 1953 for spying for the Soviet Union was still sharp in American consciousness. Anti-Semites frequently and publicly associated Jews with communism. Most important, in May of 1954, the famous Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, effectively ruling that segregation in schools was unconstitutional and opening the door for desegregation in many other realms of American life. The vast majority of Southern Jews supported the Brown decision, but most did so quietly. Meanwhile, many white Christians in the southern states did not take kindly to the decision, and Virginians were no exception. Barely a month later, Virginia Senator Harry F. Byrd began his opposition to Brown, and by August had joined with numerous other white Democrats to create the Gray Commission, ostensibly to study, but really to defeat Brown. This was the context in which Richmond Jews celebrated the American Jewish tercentenary. The most grandiose element of Richmond's tercentenary commemoration took place on October 14th, 1954, at the large local theater, then known as the Mosque. Today it's called the Altria Theater. Members of the Richmond Jewish community put on a play or pageant called Under Freedom, and Mickelbacher would feature prominently. The lead organizer of this event was Saul Weiner, a name perhaps familiar to some of you, who would go on to found the Southern Jewish Historical Society. The historical narration in the script was written by businessman Alan Krieger. Born in Boston and raised in Long Island, Krieger received his BA from Columbia and MBA from Harvard before entering the military in 1943, where he was stationed at Camp Lee, Virginia, and after the war moved to Richmond permanently. The dialogue in the play was written by Edith Lindemann Kolisch, film and theater critic for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, a songwriter and author of Jewish children's books, and the daughter-in-law of the aforementioned Rabbi Kolisch. Edith Lindemann had grown up in Pittsburgh and Dayton, Ohio, before moving with her family to Richmond while in high school. After 2 years at Barnard College in New York, she returned to Richmond, married the rabbi's son, and began her successful career. Thus, two Yankees wrote the play, which began with a prologue involving Emma Lazarus, but quickly moved to scenes from antebellum Virginia Jewish history. After a brief intermission, the chorus emerged, singing Bonnie Blue Flag, a popular Confederate song during the Civil War. The narrator began. The war between the states was a tragic pause in the material and spiritual growth of America. Despite being conceived in freedom and dedicated to liberty, Americans North and South, quote, countenanced the bondage of one color of men to another. While the North gradually abandoned the practice, radical abolitionists delivered, and quote, violent and vitriolic attacks on the institution of slavery and its supporters in the South, quote, which, according to the conventional lost cause interpretation, led to the Civil War. Jews divided according to geography. The narrator noted New York Rabbi Morris Rafal's defense of slavery in the Bible, while German-born Reform rabbis Bernard Felsenthal and David Einhorn were adamant abolitionists. The narrator recounted that over 30 Jewish men and boys served in Richmond's light infantry blues during the Civil War. The narration concluded by introducing Beth Ahaba, Reverend Maximilian J. Mickelbacher, who had composed the aforementioned prayer for the Confederacy and often traveled with troops to worship with them. The opening scene of the second act took place in 1862 on the battlefield and featured Mickelbacher reciting this prayer to various soldiers, including Robert E. Lee. That never actually happened. The prayer spoke of the northern violation of the, quote, rights, liberties, and freedom of this, our Confederacy. And the Union sought, quote, to deprive us of the glorious inheritance which was left to us by the immortal fathers of this once great republic. It called on God to defend the natural rights of the Confederates. Including this prayer, emphasized the extent of the Richmond Jewish community's participation in the Confederate cause, and by extension, their sense of belonging in the South. The final scene of the play reflected a newer generation of immigrants. Set in 1900, it depicted a Jewish family celebrating their Uncle Ben upon his naturalization as a United States citizen. Ben says that he and other new immigrants had to learn how to become an American quickly so he could forget the old unhappy things he used to know, presumably referring to anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. Then Ben pivoted back to the South, singing, "Carry Me Back to Old Virginia," and his family joined in. Between 1940 and 1997, this was the official song of the state of Virginia. This song fits entirely into Lost Cause ideology, sentimentalizing life under slavery. The song ultimately faded into America the Beautiful seamlessly, emphasizing the Americanness of Virginia and honoring the totality of the Virginia Jewish experience. This pageant showed Richmonders with shallow roots in Virginia, making a large effort to incorporate the Virginia story, including Jewish involvement in the Civil War. These Jews felt that in order to integrate into their community, they had to show themselves to be American, Virginian, Southern, and with a special connection to the city of Richmond. That meant at least a partial embrace of the lost cause. Participating in the Confederate war effort, rather than slavery, was the emphasis. 7 years later, Richmonders once again took part in a national commemoration, this time as part of the Civil War Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, a series of nationwide commemorations from 1961 to 1965 that, of course, was not limited to Jews. As Robert J. Cook documents in his 2007 book, Troubled Commemorations, the 1960s Civil War Centennial began as a combination of Cold War unity propaganda and Lost Cause nostalgia, largely excluding African Americans and relegating slavery to the margins of the conflict. Eventually, the commemoration was eclipsed by the civil rights movement and altered its tone significantly. It would not become radical, but it would move in a progressive direction, include more African Americans, and bring slavery closer to the center of the conversation about the war. Here again, context matters. 2 years after Brown v. Board, Senator Harry F. Byrd called for massive resistance to school desegregation, and he and other politicians signed the Southern Manifesto against racial integration and in favor of states' rights. They fought tooth and nail against Brown, and in some cases, real school integration did not begin until the late 1960s or even the 1970s. Southern Jews, for the most part, did not participate in massive resistance to Brown. but most did keep their heads down as the civil rights movement got underway. This was often out of fear. Starting in late 1957 and through 1958, white supremacist terrorists bombed or attempted to bomb synagogues and Jewish community centers across the South in response to perceived Jewish support for the civil rights movement. In Florida, North Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee. The most well-known bombing took place that October, when the terrorists struck Atlanta's large Reform synagogue belonging to the Hebrew Benevolent congregation known as the Temple. Due to Rabbi Jacob Rothschild's outspoken and public support for the civil rights movement, support shared by numerous congregants. The Temple bombers called themselves the Confederate Underground, implicitly linking the lost cause to anti-Semitic violence. Thus, Southern Jews felt themselves walking a tightrope. Most supported integration, but did so quietly, as they legitimately feared this very real anti-Semitic violence. Once again, for white Jews living in former Confederate states, commemoration of the lost cause provided an opportunity to assert belonging in the South, an opportunity unavailable to African Americans who still suffered from brutal lynching, ever-present racial prejudice, and debilitating legal discrimination. In effect, Jewish lost cause commemoration act as a sort of balance beam on this tightrope, where Jews could quietly support integration while loudly proclaiming their loyalty to the South. It was in this context that Richmond Jews commemorated the Civil War centennial. First, there was a traveling exhibit on Jews in the Civil War that opened in New York in 1961, went to Washington, D.C. early the next year, and came to Richmond in May of 1962. Several hundred notables, Jews and non-Jews, attended the opening. Of course, it wasn't the exact same exhibit that appeared in the North, but instead emphasized people like Dr. Simon Baruch, Judah Benjamin, and David Yulee, Confederates all. Yet there was also some indication of resistance to the lost cause narrative. In 1960, just a few weeks after the famous sit-in that took place at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina, 34 young African Americans in Richmond held a sit-in at the lunch counter of Thalheimer's department store. The Thalheimers were an old, established, wealthy German Jewish family in Richmond, active at Congregation Beth Ahaba. Yet in 1962, 2 years after the sit-ins helped desegregate the Thalheimers' lunch counter, the store's management displayed a photo of Abraham Lincoln in the window as advertisement for the Civil War centennial commemoration, symbolic of the way the winds were blowing across the country. In 1963, JFK invited the store's owner, William Thalheimer Jr., to consult on his civil rights bill. The highlight of the Jewish participation in Richmond's Civil War centennial came that same year. J. Ambler Johnston, chairman of the Richmond Civil War Centennial Committee, in conjunction with the aforementioned Saul Viner, arranged a memorial service on Sunday, October 20th, 1963, at Hebrew Cemetery for Private Henry Ginsberger, a German-born Jewish peddler who immigrated to Salem, Virginia, and had fought and died for the Confederacy. Ginsberger had been killed in action at the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864, but his grave was mislabeled Henry Gersberg, and he had been lost to history. The chief purpose of the ceremony in 1963 was to correct the gravestone and right the historical record. The ceremony began with introductory remarks by Viner and then an opening prayer by Beth Ahaba Rabbi Ariel Goldberg. Bernard Strauss, a representative of Hebrew Cemetery, spoke about the burial ground, followed by Johnston, who told the story of Henry Ginsberger. Richmond's mayor, Eleanor P. Shepard, delivered some remarks. Finally, Kate Bendheim unveiled the new tombstone. Bendheim was the great-great-granddaughter of Reverend Maximilian J. Michelbacher. By contrast, Saul Weiner's family had immigrated from Eastern Europe long after the Civil War, and he was born and raised in West Virginia, which had split from Virginia to remain with the Union. Bethahaba Rabbi Ariel Goldberg was a Northerner, born in St. Louis, growing up there and in Quincy, Illinois. Ordained at Hebrew Union College, he did graduate work at the University of Chicago, Harvard, and Oxford. After Goldberg's opening prayer, Weiner explained that the purpose of the ceremony was, I quote, to establish a better understanding of the forces which resulted in the tragedy a century ago. In 1963, the lost cause narrative was still dominant, especially in the South. But it was not hegemonic, and the notion that slavery was an absolute evil and the central cause of the conflict had begun to gain more prominence. Weiner, an amateur historian, may not have been privy to the ins and outs of these debates, but his comments left open the possibility of more objective analysis of the past. In his concluding remarks, Weiner explained, quote, "Our role is not to glorify war, but to renew the past for the benefit, we hope, of the present and the future. Our role has further been to tell the story of how the average man or woman, the you or I, of 100 years ago, was affected by the war." End quote. For that reason, they sought, quote again, to memorialize a lone Jewish youth who met his death on a field of battle near this city, far from home and family. And through this ceremony, remember all who fell. He then made reference to Reverend Michelbacher, whose prayer for the Confederate soldiers, quote, still lives on. Saul Weiner's rhetoric is instructive here. His is the language of the social historian, showing concern for the average man or woman, though still excluding African Americans. In his remarks honoring fallen Confederate soldiers, Weiner did what the Passover story does: invite modern-day Jews to imagine themselves in a historical era, except instead of placing themselves during the exodus from Egypt, at Mount Sinai, or entering the Promised Land, he is asking his audience to imagine themselves as Jews fighting for the Confederacy. Weiner, a West Virginian, whose family again came long after the Civil War, was placing himself and other Southern Jews in the supposedly heroic Confederate narrative. The final act of Jewish participation in the Richmond Civil War centennial came in June of 1965. By this time, the Civil Rights Act had passed. Martin Luther King Jr. and others had led the famous march from Selma to Montgomery, and the Voting Rights Act had been sent to Congress. This was the context when, for 4 days, June 16th to 19th, 1965, the Richmond Civil War Centennial Committee put on a pageant at the new theater, outdoor theater, Dogwood Dell in Byrd Park. They called it Richmond Under Two Flags, which told the story of the Confederate capital during the Civil War. Saul Weiner oversaw the production. The script was written by Stanley Markell and Rose Kaufman Banks, two prominent members of the Richmond Jewish community. The play was mostly lost cause nostalgia, barely mentioning slavery and largely ignoring African Americans. But Saul Weiner and Rose Banks had met with Harry Williams, principal of Maggie Walker High School, then a segregated African American high school in Richmond, and other representatives from the black community several weeks prior to discuss black representation in the pageant. They wanted African Americans to be involved, but as Banks noted in a letter to Williams, quote, "We understand in inviting Negro participation in the Richmond Civil War Centennial Committee's production of Richmond Under Two Flags, we will use no Negro dialect, no mammy or field hand type of costumes, no comedy at the expense of the Negro race, and no mention of slavery." Quote. African Americans would be included, supposedly, in 6 of 14 scenes, and that would include 20 men and 10 women. Whether they were in fact included, I have yet to determine. We do know that several Jews appeared in the production, and that Thalheimer's sponsored the event with these words on the program. Thalheimer salutes Richmond on the James for upholding the ideals of freedom and democracy when this nation became an indivisible union, united under one flag. The implication of this message from the Jewish-owned department store seemed to challenge the lost cause, that it was only the conclusion of the war and the freeing of the enslaved that led to true freedom and democracy. This reflected Jewish support for the civil rights movement across the country. Yet the play itself advanced a lost cause narrative. Most remarkable about Richmond under two flags, which again was for the broader Richmond community, was how much Jews were incorporated in the script. 2 scenes involved Reverend Michelbacher, one of which was adapted from the 1954 centenary play, and included the famous prayer for the Confederacy. At one point in this newer pageant, Michelbacher claims that there are more than 10,000 Jewish boys serving in the Confederate Army. Modern Civil War scholar Robert Rosen estimates that only 2,000 Jews served as Confederate soldiers. This exaggeration is important. In a pageant for the general public, Jewish scriptwriters massively, if perhaps unknowingly, overemphasized Jewish participation in the Confederate cause. Michelbacher, a Richmonder, is portrayed as a hero, bravely supporting his troops. At one point, he says to his wife, "You were born in Virginia, but this is my adopted country. I am proud of it, and proud of the religious, God-fearing men who lead it. I must do everything I can." Michelbacher's immigrant origins are important. He's a newcomer to America, to Virginia, and to Richmond, just like so many Jewish Richmonders in 1965, and if not them, their parents or grandparents. The effect of this rhetoric is to say, we Richmond Jews are Southerners. We belong here. This history is our history. For Jews like Weiner, pride in Southern Jewish history was a path to more complete integration and acceptance. By the late 19th century, Jews in New York or Chicago did not really need to use Civil War memory to integrate. But for Southern Jews, the lost cause was a ticket to entry to full acceptance. Only with the successes of the civil rights movement could that narrative be challenged, including, to a small degree, in this Jewish-led production for Richmond's Civil War centennial. After the civil rights movement, lost cause commemoration did not disappear, but it did gradually fall out of favor, particularly among the Jewish community in the South. The Southern Jewish community became less distinctly Southern, as more Jews have migrated from the North to places like Atlanta, Houston, and the Research Triangle area where I'm now giving this lecture. Younger generations of Jews born in the South have little interest in lost cause commemoration. And advances in the fields of U.S. history in general and American Jewish history in particular have led to a reevaluation of the legacy of Jewish Confederates. A simple thought experiment should demonstrate how much has changed. In 2010, the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History opened in Philadelphia with an exhibit titled "Only in America." 18 individuals were displayed in a sort of Hall of Fame for American Jews, 10 selected by a panel of scholars, and 8 by an online vote open to the public. Honorees included 19th century figures such as Reform Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise and poet Emma Lazarus, to modern celebrities like Sandy Koufax and Barbara Streisand. Judah P. Benjamin was, rightly and unsurprisingly, not among them. But had such a list been made 100 years prior, or perhaps even 50 years prior, he almost certainly would have been included in an American Jewish Hall of Fame. Judah Benjamin is, of course, featured in the museum, which tells the history of American Jewry, just as he is featured in the new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, which opened in New Orleans last year. Benjamin and all Jewish Confederates belong in history museums, in our works of scholarship, where they should be remembered and studied, but not celebrated. And as Jews, particularly of the younger generation, have been involved in the mass movements to remove Confederate monuments across the country that followed the murder of George Floyd, we should note that monuments and plaques to Judah P. Benjamin have also been removed in Charlotte, in Sarasota, Florida, even in California. They too should be moved to museums, so future generations of historians can study how and why some Jews once chose to celebrate the Confederacy, but are now aiding in the effort to undo the racist and treasonous Confederate legacy. As Americans, Jews and non-Jews alike, continue to fight the culture wars, understanding this trajectory from Confederate celebration to rejection and repudiation can help us remember which side we are on for the battles still to come. Thank you. There are questions, feel free. You got to go to the basketball game, feel free.
So thank you for that fascinating talk. I think we all learned a great deal. And for questions, I have a microphone. I'd be happy to carry it around. Thank you.
I just wonder if there are any outstanding historical examples of Southern Jews who spoke out against the Confederacy or even joined the Union?
There are some examples. There are not too many. I mean, the most celebrated example is one of the rabbis that I mentioned, David Einhorn, who was actually a rabbi in Baltimore, so technically part of the Union, but a slave state. And he gave a speech denouncing slavery and was actually, his congregation got so angry, they essentially ran him off the bema and he had to spend the war in Philadelphia. So there are some examples of that. And there are examples of people after the Civil War. For example, Leonard Rogoff is here, and Gertrude Wheel, when she was interviewed by Eli Evans in the 1970s, which is pretty early, right, was saying that the lost cause was not something that should have been celebrated. Right? She was saying this is something that we should have tried to put behind us. Interestingly, even the woman who co-wrote the play in 1954 that I mentioned, Edith Lindemann Kalisch, she later on would actually speak out against the lost cause. When the centennial came around 7 years later, she said, why are we still talking about this, right? This is not good for Richmond, and we've moved on, really sort of trying to, diffuse the situation a bit. The truth is also that this talk is a little untraditional in that it's not a book talk. I'm at the beginning of this research. I've written one paper on the subject. I still have a lot more research to do, so I'm hoping to find more examples as well.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So I worked in Richmond before I moved here. for a job. And so it's fascinating to see how important the context is. So when you talk about the context, there's like that national context of how we're moving, how quickly the narrative changes as the civil rights movement starts to unfold. I wondered if you could talk about what of this is so Richmond specific, because I found Richmond to be so deeply ossified when it came to its place in history, and how much that maybe overdetermines how tight the tightrope was that Southern Jewish people had to walk, and whether or not you can speak to some of the differences across that sort of pan-Southern identity that you referenced at the beginning of your talk. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I do think Richmond is somewhat exceptional. I mean, Richmond is, I was just saying, it's a city that's utterly obsessed with its own history. Richmond's, I mean, this is the way others might phrase it. The high point of that history was the Civil War, right? Richmond is no longer a significant city in the United States. It was one of the most significant cities for 4 years. So I think there is a lot of clinging to that, obviously, and I think it is different than other places in the South. I mean, Atlanta is sort of maybe a kind of obvious difference. Atlanta, supposedly the mayor claims it, right? It's the city too busy to hate, I think, said in the 1950s, right? And so I think there was perhaps less of a tightrope there. And yet, an example, I mean, I have more examples. I wasn't able to include everything. In 1954, for the tercentenary in Atlanta, the Atlanta Jewish community gave a portrait of Judah P. Benjamin to the Atlanta sort of city cyclorama, it was called, right? Which is pretty remarkable because Judah P. Benjamin had no connection to Georgia at all, right? So this was clearly Atlanta Jews saying, we feel part of this larger Southern community through this figure of Judah P. Benjamin, who, of course, for those of you who don't know, I mean, after his bar mitzvah, he essentially stopped being Jewish, right? I mean, there was nothing Jewish about him in his adult life. He never set foot in a synagogue. He married a Catholic woman, just had no Jewish content in his life at all. But Jews celebrated him because he had, particularly Southern Jews celebrated him because of this elevated position. As I said, it wasn't just in Richmond, it was in Charleston, where Judah P. Benjamin had grown up a bit. In Charlotte, North Carolina, there was actually a monument to Judah P. Benjamin placed in 1948. The United Daughters of the Confederacy asked the local Charlotte Jewish community to put up a monument for Judah Benjamin because when he was fleeing the Confederacy at the end of the war, a Jewish man in Charlotte had hosted him for one night before he made his way to the Caribbean and then off to London, where he lived the rest of his life. But in any case, right, the Charlotte Jewish community, it was actually sort of complicated. They didn't love the fact that they had this memorial there. They weren't as enamored of it. But the fact that it existed, that there's one, as I said, in Sarasota, Florida. And I should also say Jews in the North also celebrated Judah P. Benjamin. That's another thing. That took longer, or it wasn't as deeply felt in the North, I would say. But certainly there were Northern Jewish publications that would list him among great American Jews and things like that. So it wasn't just a Southern thing, but I do think it was obviously, there was this kind of use of the lost cause across the South as this way to fit in. And remember, those synagogue bombings are happening all over the South. They're happening in Florida. They're happening in Tennessee at a JCC, right? So it really is a pan-Southern thing. Yeah. No. Oh, wait, do we have the mic? Is there one more question? Or you have a question? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Place that hasn't been mentioned much or at all in this presentation is Texas. And I'm curious if there's any uniquely Texan flavor of this, especially as it relates to Jewish involvement and activism around the border and Texan identity.
It's a great question, and the answer is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry about that. Okay. It's a great question. I haven't really done the research yet in terms of Texas. Texas is a really interesting case in American Jewish history because there was often a kind of synergy between Zionism and the kind of frontier experience that Jews in Texas imagined themselves experiencing. Ironically, there were militantly anti-Zionist Jews who were also very powerful at the beginning of the 20th century in Texas as well, kind of saying we're the real pioneers, not the people out in Palestine. That's another thing that's part of this story. The Reform movement, Rabbi Kalish, who I talked about in Richmond, was one of the leading anti-Zionist Reform rabbis at the beginning of the 20th century. He was militantly opposed to focus on Palestine. He wanted to say, we're American, we belong in America, we're not thinking about immigrating at all. The Reform movement in general was really anti-Zionist, at least officially. There were individual Reform rabbis. Sorry, I got off on this little tangent. But it was really officially anti-Zionist until the 1930s, and really until the 60s, actually, did it really kind of change over that way. So that's another interesting part of the story, right? For Kalish, fitting in is important. Fitting in means not thinking about Palestine, and fitting in means embracing the lost cause, even though Kalish is from the Midwest.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for this talk. It's such an important book, and I can't wait to see it. I'm kind of a two-part thing related to the contemporary South. I wondered, and maybe I saw in the papers, did Beth Ahaba, here's the first part, do anything or react or make public statements as monuments were coming down, because it was like right in front of their synagogue practically? And then also, I guess, maybe Charlottesville and Beth Israel. Is it Beth Israel? Yeah, in Charlottesville might have to be like a whole chapter for you with how they react to the most, violent of lost cause and white supremacy and white terrorism, with Unite the Right and the Proud Boys.
Thank you, Marcy, for those questions. They're really important. Beth Ahaba was actually, a brick was thrown at Beth Ahaba during one of the sort of anti-monument riots where the Black Lives Matter movement was heavily involved. But then it was later discovered that the person who threw the brick probably didn't know it was a synagogue and was just someone kind of making mayhem. So there was there was tension there, obviously, that diffused fairly quickly from my recollection. In terms, I don't know if any public statements were really made. I mean, the synagogue that I belong to in Richmond, Temple Bethel, a conservative synagogue, actually has the most progressive rabbi in the city. It's not the Reform movement there. And he was very outspoken in trying to get the monuments taken down. A friend of mine, Rabbi Michael Knopf. But in terms of Charlottesville, Charlottesville, of course, was so troubling because you would see side by side swastikas and Confederate flags, right? So you really saw the linking. This is another thing that's so fascinating that I didn't have time to get into. In 1958, when the temple is bombed in Atlanta, and the people who claim the bombing call themselves the Confederate Underground, you had people who were militantly anti-Brown, who were racist segregationists, like I believe it was the governor of Virginia at the time, Governor Lindsay, if I'm not mistaken, who said, "This is terrible. How dare they tarnish the name of the Confederacy by associating it with anti-Semitism? The Confederacy always loved its Jews, right? We had the Jews were always welcome in the South." So there was a real pushback against linking the Confederacy with anti-Semitism. as we sort of saw, it wasn't, there were many Jews who did fight for the Confederacy, as we saw. Now, 2017 in Charlottesville, you have the swastika and the Confederate flag next to each other. And of course, you see that again on January 6th. Right, on January 6th, you see the swastika, you see the Confederate flag, but then also horrifically, I shouldn't say horrifically, you see some Jews supporting those movements as well, right, alongside the swastika and the Confederate flag. Not many, but some. So it remains complicated and problematic.
So I'm just thinking about what about the women's organizations within the Jewish faith, and where were they, especially coming up in the 30s and 40s, and then toward the civil rights? That's got to cause some kind of, I don't know. Can you speak to any of that? And are you aware of any women that were saying, well, this doesn't sound that good, and holding on to the lost cause rhetoric and everything? I'm just curious about that, where they were.
Well, Jewish women's organizations were involved, as it were, on both sides of this issue, right? I mean, there were Jewish women's organizations in the South, as I mentioned earlier on, like the Hebrew Ladies Memorial Association, that was heavily invested in lost cause commemoration, like their Christian women compatriots. This was something that women did. There's a whole book about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which did have some Jewish members, right? And how implicated they are in the lost cause commemoration. But as we get closer to the civil rights movement, certainly there are Jewish women who are active in the civil rights movement. There are Jewish women who are forming partnerships with African American women. We definitely see that. I mean, to me, what's so interesting, and this is something I really want to get to the heart of, it's not just about women, of course, but it's about all Jews involved in this way, is that I really do get the sense that for some Jews, objecting to segregation, right, supporting civil rights, supporting Brown, supporting Martin Luther King, was something that made sense to them because it was very American, right? It was all people are created equal. And yet, at the same time, they still felt like they could hold on to the lost cause to say, but we're still part of the South. Right? We don't want to run the risk of endangering our status in this community. So we could still, celebrate Judah P. Benjamin, but also, support Brown v. Board.
Well, thank you for that amazing talk, and also thanks to the audience for the questions. I think it's time to let our lecturer take a break. So thank you again for coming, and let's give one last round of applause to David Weinfeld.
Thank you. Thank you.